So let's do it. We are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lawyers Who Stream, episode 3. Joining me is our wonderful guest, Andrew Rogers. Andrew is the privacy officer and freedom of information coordinator at Kingston Health Sciences Center and is here to talk to us about hospital law and his interesting career trajectory. So, Andrew, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I got interested in law during high school, and
Mm.
I was lucky enough to go to a high school that offered sort of a Canadian law course, and um, kind of spent a couple of years trying to decide if I wanted to do that or architecture, and ended up doing criminology at Ryerson University for my undergrad.
Hmm.
And after, I think I was bound for law school all along. It was never a decision of like, maybe I'll go to law school. I think I had always intended to do that.
Hmm.
Um, and then, so after I graduated Ryerson, I did the whole LSAT course and all of that stuff. And then I ended up applying to a bunch of different places, and um, chose Halifax because I had family there, and lived with them for the whole 3 years that I was out in Halifax,
Nice.
and loved it. Loved Halifax. Loved Dalhousie. It's a very interesting bubble, in a sense, no pun intended. Now that they literally are the Atlantic bubble, but I think I went back after law school, and it was the same place, like very friendly, and you sort of don't know the East Coast until you've lived on the East Coast, um, but being there with like a group of friends who were all studying the same thing and going through the same like trials and tribulations of law school was a very unique experience.
Mhm.
Um, and then in the later years of law school, I started taking health law courses, and that was when I sort of realized that's what I wanted to do. And
Mm.
Dalhousie actually had a specialization in health law and policy, so I took all the necessary courses for that, and I graduated with a specialization in health law and policy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually because, not a lot of law schools offer that type of specialization at the JD level. LLMs, of course, you can specialize, but at the JD level in Windsor, unless you were taking a dual degree of some kind, like an MSW or MBA or the dual program in the States, you're just getting a JD. So I was going to ask if you maybe chose Dalhousie because of their health law specialization program, but it sounds like you picked it for other personal reasons. But
Yeah,
you think it worked
I
out that way?
actually didn't like
Hmm.
I didn't even know it existed, and they do have like a joint Masters of Health Administration program with their JD, but it was just kind of like I in my undergrad I had a minor in psychology, and I'd always been interested in sort of how the law and those kinds of things intersect. And I had a bunch of friends who had taken health law in second year, and it sounded really interesting, and so I just took it on a whim and ended up loving it. And when I saw that there were a whole bunch of courses I could take related to it, that was kind of when I realized like this is the type of law that I want to do when I graduate. And it was sort of different than corporate law or criminal law or those areas, which are a lot of my
Mm.
friends were sort of studying and going into. And I think because it was unique and interesting to me, I knew I should sort of follow that path.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been health law is. I tell people often who want to get into health law that's such an expansive area of law. It touches so many things, and yet it's not very well promoted or publicized in law schools. Like I don't believe that health law was offered as a course at U Windsor. I kind of had to figure it out for myself after I graduated. That's what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
So it's awesome that that was available. And
Yeah.
so what were they teaching you in that health law course? Like, what was the curriculum?
There were a lot of sort of decisions that impact, like SCC decisions that impacted sort of universal healthcare in Canada in unique ways. So positive rights to healthcare, and how kind of the history of how that came about in Canada, which is very fascinating to study and to now watch it play out in the States, because you kind of it's sort of like a hindsight is 2020 thing because it was not popular in Canada at all, universal healthcare, when it first came about.
Hmm.
And so to watch the same struggle happen in the States is very interesting. But it was kind of that historical context and all the decisions that sort of led up to that. And then different decisions like Morgentaler and stuff like that, which by that point I knew fairly well, having done an undergrad in criminology, but it was still interesting to learn it from a different perspective rather than thinking of it as the sort of criminal perspective, thinking about it about how it became like now we were in Canada where abortion is legal and that kind of thing. So it was
Hmm.
all those sort of courses, and it was a very general course, like you said. Health law is kind of a anomaly. It's very um, it sort of gets defined by whatever gets thrown into it, um, but then the other courses that were part of that were sort of like civil and criminal, mental health law,
Right.
uh, medical malpractice is one of the courses that I took. Just a whole bunch of interesting stuff, and that got me interested in um, like wanting to, like, when I graduated from law school, I knew like I could probably practice in a firm and do health law, but I that isn't really what appealed to me. Like that wasn't how I wanted to use that knowledge. It was more what fascinated me was how health law kind of helps people. Like this is an area of law where like it really directly impacts people. Like you're not like when you do corporate law, you're dealing with sort of the face of a corporation, but in this case, you're really dealing with like a human being. Like if you think about like the assisted suicide cases that came up through the courts,
Hmm.
like this is a person. Like yes, they're a person that represents a cause, but it really is like a human being behind uh, the decision, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and you touched on something really fascinating that interests me about health law, like the way it's so personal and the way that it touches on people. There was a question from Greg Nola. Why did you get into tax law too? I don't know what the history behind that question is. Did you do tax law as well?
Oh, yes, what a funny story. So tax law was a very competitive course at Dalhousie
Mm,
because of the fact that it churns out a lot of corporate lawyers. And I just literally took it because I heard it would be on the bar exam. And ultimately, it was one question on the bar exam. And that question got thrown out because they miscalculated the answer. So
it's
it
pretty
was probably a
typical.
waste of a course. But I took it because, like, partially because it was so competitive, like I wanted to learn it and I thought like it would be an interesting skill to have. So I took
Mm,
that and then I just ended up taking corporate tax law and I actually really enjoyed it, which is something not a lot
wow.
of people probably can say. Like I and I think it might have been the study group I had. Like I had a really good group of friends who we all got together and we studied tax law together. And I remember when we first started studying, I I was the person in the group who was like, you need to teach me everything. And
Hmm.
by the end of it, I was teaching them. And I think like it just made a lot of sense to me. So I think I ended up enjoying it more than the average person would have.
I think I took tax law for the same reason that I thought I'd be on the bar exam, but it ended up being, yeah, two, maybe three questions that year, and that's always the way it is.
Yeah.
But the real reason I took it was apparently the professor was fantastic, and she was really motivating and engaged, and it kind of proved to me, I think, at that point that any subject of the law can be interesting if you have the right teacher, and it sounds like you had the right environment with this study group as well to
Yeah,
make it good.
absolutely. And again, I had a really good teacher for it too. We actually had two
Mm,
separate like profs for it. And my prof he taught in a very different way than the other prof, who was actually the dean of the law school at the time. And so there were people in both sections who kind of preferred one of the teaching methods to the other. And I think I just really enjoyed his teaching style. And we often like swapped notes between sections because the way one of them may have explained it was like easier for someone to understand than the way the other one did. So
mm.
it was interesting in that sense. And I think I got lucky that I ended up in the course with the prof that I really learned well from.
Very cool. Just taking us back on track, Greg Nola also asked if you did a mental health law in your practice, and that reminded me actually there was one health law course at the University of Windsor that I took, and that was mental health in the law, who was taught by a fantastic former uh, legal aid guy, now at the Law Commission, who took us all through the ins and outs of the mental health system and the consent and capacity system in Ontario, and yeah, that's a big part of health law as well, from what I understand.
Yeah, and yeah, so I took two mental health law courses, civil and criminal. They were taught separately and
Mm,
both taught by very well-known sort of mental health expert Archie Kaiser. Very interesting. Like if you hear about a case that somehow intersects with mental health law, especially if it's on the East Coast, he's probably the person they're going to interview. He's just a like fascinating guy and knows a lot about it and taught
right.
it very well. And I actually ended up like I did pro bono work when I was at Dalhousie, and I ended up doing it at the mental health courts there with the Elizabeth Fry Society.
Mm,
So just like fascinating stuff. And
yeah, great organization too.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And that was also kind of what inspired me to continue with health law, because you like I met the people who it was really impacting on a day-to-day basis. Like it wasn't sort of an abstract concept of like, yes, there are people who affected, like I knew their names and I met them and interviewed them,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah. Is that something you touch on in your hospital life, or I guess as the privacy and information officer, that's sort of outside of your purview, right?
yeah, so it kind of I guess how I went from law school to that is like when I graduated law school, I went through like the OCI process and interviewed with firms and stuff, and
Hmm.
I kind of got the vibe from that that like firm life wasn't for me, and maybe that came across in my interviews because I was like, I don't know if I can do this.
I've
Like
been
I
I've been there. Yeah,
yeah
they can feel the lack of, I guess they call it lack of fit, when you
yeah
feel
and
like you really like don't belong there.
yeah, and especially on the East Coast, like they're looking for someone who is going to stay on the East Coast, right? And I think
Right. Yeah, because
despite my
you did the Halifax OCIs. Did you do Toronto OCIs as well, or just East Coast?
I just did the East Coast. Yeah. Because I really thought with family out there, I could stay out there, but I think they saw through my, like, I might have believed it at the time, but they saw through it.
Mm,
Um, and I sort of knew, like, in my heart of hearts that that wasn't what I wanted to do. So,
right.
like, when I graduated law school, that was when I started to look for, like, how can I do this type of law without doing it in a firm. And fortunately for me, like that was the year the law practice program like came into being,
Hmm.
um, and I knew as part of that, like they were going to place people with hospitals and other organizations like that where like you could do that kind of law. So I signed up and I joined it,
Mm,
um, and like part of the process was like you submit your resume and your cover letter and all of that, and you basically like choose like at the time at least you picked and choose where you sort of wanted to apply, but they didn't tell you exactly where it was. Like you just knew like this it's a hospital, you'd be working in their legal department, yada yada yada. So
so you
it
sort of checked out, you checked off kind of hospital, or I guess you submitted interest in hospital, but then they placed you wherever they could.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm,
And yeah, so the employers would see everything about you, but you wouldn't see everything about the employers until they decided like, hey, we want you and we want to schedule an interview. And so at the time I like there was a sort of a day or a couple of days where you would get called, and I got called by like four or five different hospitals all on the
oh,
same
amazing.
day. And so I was like, okay, great. And I did the interview at the first one, which was St. Michael's in Toronto. And I thought it was going to be like an interview process where like I do that interview and then I do another interview and I get to decide who I want. But it was not like
Mm.
St. Michael's. I interviewed with them and they said, yes, we want you. And I was told by the law practice program that like if you get a yes, you have to take it.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. You don't get to sit on it for the other interviews. You just like, nope, you get it. You're
No,
in.
and
Okay.
and the second one was with CAMH, and I was like, I wanted to work with CAMH because of my like mental health background and
Mm,
minor in psychology and all of that stuff. So I was a little, I maybe was like a little stung and heartbroken, but it actually ended up fine. I think
yeah.
I probably was. like I think they were doing it because there were so many people that they needed to match up with placements,
Mhm.
and basically like if you got the yes, they locked it in when they could, right? Because they
Yeah.
didn't want to be in a situation where you say no to a bunch of people and then you have nowhere to go.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you actually. I'm glad you jumped right into it because I was going to ask you about going through the law practice program because it's something that I personally don't know a whole lot about.
Mhm,
This sort of matching system they have in place. Do you
mhm.
feel like it works well, or is there room for tweaking? Maybe.
So I don't know how, like, I don't know what it's like now, but
Hmm.
at the time,
I guess that was the
I,
first year. Yeah.
yeah, like it worked well in the sense that like it definitely matched me with something that I wanted to do. And I ended up, so I was working in their legal department with their general counsel for um, 4 months of the law practice program and
Hmm.
doing basically in the same way you would with articling, like they would give you whatever um, work that they thought you could handle, and then you would do it, and then you'd submit it to them and get feedback. Like I think the one good thing is like based on what I was hearing from my friends who were going through sort of traditional articling, it was a little more mentoring and interactive. Like you'd actually get to sit down with like your mentor and they would talk to you and you'd have like weekly meetings and discuss the assignments and all of
Mm.
that and give you feedback, and at the end of the process they'd fill out a questionnaire about how you did and rank you and all of that stuff. um, and it was not easy, like I will say that, like
Yeah.
it what like they didn't dumb it down at all. Like I was doing like pretty difficult legal work for someone who had never practiced, and like they were having me draft like memos and doing legal research and answering like pretty tough legal questions and talking to people in the hospital
Hmm.
and basically like taking in the information, doing my own research, and then when I came to a decision I would run it by my mentor and say like based on what I've learned this is what I think the answer is. And sometimes they'd say you're right, and sometimes they'd say no, that's not, go back to the drawing board.
Well, that part sounds pretty on par with articling, although I guess the main difference would be there's much less of a ramp up period, right? Because you're only there for 4 months, they're probably just putting you right in the fire, like, okay, start doing this work immediately.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so that was the half of the law practice program, and then the other half was like a very practical, um, I would say like crash course in every area of law. So
Hmm.
they had they had sort of created clients, and they hired actors to play the clients, and you would interview them and go through the entire file from like opening to closure. And obviously it was like a very sped up process because
Yeah.
as you know, a file doesn't move that quickly often. Uh, but you do, like we did family law negotiations between like a husband and a wife. We did like business negotiations. We did like a criminal trial, like cross examination and examining witnesses, and
Wow.
we did, yeah. So like we did a real estate file, like from sort of like searching through to make sure there's nothing on the property and all of that stuff. Like
S-
very interesting to do all those different areas of law
Yeah,
because
and a very well-rounded experience too. I mean, normally when you article, you don't get that, but you're very focused on one area of law. And granted, it's probably the type of law that you want to go into, or you figure out very quickly that it's not. But yeah, that's a very to be able to sample all those different things before going into your placement sounds like it could be hugely beneficial.
yeah, and you do sort of at the beginning of it, you do a crash course with like an expert in that area of law. So
Hmm.
there were a couple people that now I can't remember them, but I see them all the time on like legal Twitter and stuff, and I'm like, I know you from the law practice program. Um, Orlando De Silva was one of them.
Yes, great guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So he did one of my crash courses, and so they do the crash course with you, and then for like a week or two, you're dumped into that file, and you basically go through all the ins and outs of it, and
Hmm.
then by the end of that week or two, you close the file, and then you get assessed on it to say, here's like you did everything right in these situations and whatever. So it was really interesting, and I think I like if I compare it to the traditional articling process, I think I probably learned more about more areas of law, but you don't get sort of like in a traditional articling process, you get like a very focused view of like one area of law or a small group of area of laws because that's the firm that you're working for and
Yeah.
that's where you ultimately might end up practicing.
Mhm.
But in some ways, it was better the way I did it because you could cut like I think a lot of people came into that not knowing what area of law they wanted to practice,
Mhm.
and by the time they finished, they said, "Well, of the modules that we did, this was the one I enjoyed the most."
Yeah. Absolutely. Since you went through the LPP at Ryerson and also you did your undergrad at Ryerson, Greg Knoll has another question. How do you feel about them opening a law school? And then some follow-ups. Contributing to the articling crisis, is it necessary? Is their innovative approach sort of going to let them make a name for themselves as a law school? What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think my gut reaction when I hear more law schools is no.
Yeah, I
I
think
like I
that's
don't
everyone had that initial reaction for sure.
yeah, like I don't think right now I don't think the world needs more lawyers. I think what we need is more access to justice. And right now it's very incongruent, right? Like
Hmm.
we're churning out lawyers at a record pace, but we have so many people who can't afford a lawyer and can't get a lawyer when they need one.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to solve that problem before we sort of open the doors and churn out even more lawyers. It's like opening factories for something that no one's buying or no one can afford to buy.
Hmm.
Um, and but I do like having been there, like I was the year I was there was when they opened the legal innovation zone and there was a lot of discussion about this innovative approach. I think that's something that is unique to them, and I think that is something that maybe the legal field is missing. And I think if they execute it well, and if they bring sort of like fresh young talent and sort of young people who are creative and are thinking differently and thinking about how can technology sort of fix some of the problems in the law, I think those things could be really beneficial for the legal field. So I think it's sort of a double-edged sword in that you're going to be churning out more lawyers, but you may also churn out some people who really could make a difference in the legal field. So I think I'm not opposed to it in the sense that it could have a really positive effect.
Yeah, I think your point about needing innovation and that this new law school can definitely bring that is a good one. I think if anyone can do it, it's probably a newer school like Ryerson. Yeah, the analogy I was thinking in my head of, we're churning out luxury sedans when we really just need yeah, we're trying out, sorry, luxury convertibles when we really just need like family sedans, like more
Mhm,
lawyers that can serve broader amount of the population that are less expensive. We need less expensive tuition, and maybe we'll start to see a trend in the opposite direction now, making law schools a little bit more affordable as we see the problem. But
mhm,
yeah, it'll be. And other things like technology, like everything going remote now, also cuts down on costs. Smaller firms cut down on costs, like taking things out of the major firms on Bay Street can help a bit as well. But there needs to be a cultural shift, I agree. And yeah, it's a bit incongruous that when you provide more of something, it remains just as unaffordable to the majority of the population. So,
yeah. Well, and I know like part of our law, like the year we went through it, there was a contest to design like the most creative like legal innovative solution that could fix the access to justice problem. And it
mm,
was really fascinating watching all the other groups' ideas. And our group actually ended up being a podcast. It was
wow.
um, we wanted to do like little short videos of like having experts talk about sort of the basic things in like family law court and stuff like this so that when people do represent themselves they can listen to these sort of like mini episodes to say like here's the things you need to know about this particular area of law before you like do self-representation. And
Mm,
I don't think we executed it to 100%. Like I think if we had more time and more resources and could speak to some of those experts we might have churned out a better product. But I think that idea is definitely something that's now like people are doing that.
hmm can that podcast be found anywhere? Is it available?
uh,
Hmm.
I still have the episodes on my computer, but you don't want to see them.
Okay, yeah, they're locked away in vaults, but the idea is
Yeah,
there. The spark is there. Maybe someday.
yeah, they
Mhm.
were edited very poorly.
Gotta talk to A. Get A on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um. Oh, where was I going with that point? Legal innovation, Ryerson. Let's see what I got here on my notes. Oh, yeah. So I was thinking, actually, you're in sort of what might be described as an alternate legal career, working in hospitals. Do you think that there is room for, even with more lawyers coming out of newer schools like Ryerson, is there still room for legally trained people to do good work kind of outside of traditional practice, you think? And what's been your experience working at a hospital and doing that sort of work?
I think so. Like I people honestly like the feedback I've heard. So my predecessor was a fantastic privacy officer. Like
Hmm.
having walked like stepped into the shoes of someone who sort of had a very big impact on the organization. Um, but I've also heard that like I sort of bring a totally different element where her experience was what earned her respect. It's my sort of credentials that earned me my respect, and that just knowing the law inside and out often is it. That's what people want to hear. Like if I can
So
cite
sorry,
this,
your predecessor not legally trained.
no, she was not a lawyer, not legally trained at all.
Hmm.
But like often when we're sort of muddling through a thorny issue, it's when I can do that legal research and say, okay, here is my take on this. And sometimes I think I'm sort of out of my element. Like if it's an area of law where like I'm not an expert, I say like we need external legal counsel on this issue. But um, like just to have someone who can actually like wade through legislation and read that language and tell them like this is my gut feel on this, and I
Hmm.
think um, this is probably the way to go with it. But even having the ability to issue spot and say like we need external legal counsel, and I think that ultimately saves them a lot of money, right? Like
Yeah.
is you might ask those very cursory questions to legal counsel and that would cost you a lot of money, whereas if you have someone in house who is a lawyer, they can give you sort of that little bit of here's sort of the direction you should go in.
Hmm. Got one more question about what's been like with COVID. We were talking a little bit this. We were talking about this a little bit during the pre-show, but why don't you tell us about your experience with that, and then we'll end on that note.
Yeah, I think I told you that I would if somebody had told me or given me a crystal ball 5 years ago and said like you're going to end up working at a hospital during a global pandemic, I probably would have said no. But
Nope,
now
I'm
I've
going to criminal law. See ya.
yeah, yeah, at this point that seems more appetizing, but in some ways it's also it comes back to what we talked about earlier, that like you're really helping people. Like part of my role
Hmm.
has been like setting up the COVID assessment center and making sure like people can book online in a way that protects their privacy. And now we're
Yeah.
working on the vaccine rollout in a way that is accessible and it gets to the people who need it the most. Like with the new direction from the government that came out, like
Hmm.
we're now pivoting to figure out like how do we contact the patients who are in those high risk groups and get them vaccinated as quickly as possible and do it in a way that like if we're contacting someone who's 20 or someone who's 85, both of them are able to book their appointment easily and get to the hospital and get the vaccine. Or if they're not able to get to the hospital, we can come to them and give them the vaccine. Like it's a whole bunch of interesting considerations that I think I never thought I'd be a part of when I went to law school. Like I think that's what the alternative career path has led me to, is like it's put me in the thick of very interesting things and actually made me feel like at the end of the day when I shut my computer off, like I've done good. Like people will get their vaccine because of the work that I've done.
Excellent. Super fulfilling work and really important right now. Just we need. I think that people, when they look at Twitter, when they look online and hear the news about the changes in vaccine rollout, they don't really grasp all the time, like all the hard work that's being done behind the scenes to make this rollout work. And it's not easy. And there's a reason why it's taken this long to ramp up, at every level. There's really so many logistical challenges to solve, and you're a part of that chain. So definitely thank you for, for doing your part in that.
Yeah, no, I love it, and it really is like I can't say enough about like my colleagues who are like working around the clock, like triple multitasking. Like we'll be in a meeting and they're doing three other things, all
Hmm.
so that we can get that letter, that appointment out to the patient that much sooner.
Yeah.
And I think it really is a testament to how much these people care about this work. And so I think like that's why like it's hard for me to be cynical. Like I read all this stuff on Twitter and I'm like, yes, this vaccine rollout is like so frustratingly slow when you see what's going on in the States. But I'm also like, I know behind the scenes, there's a lot of like really good people doing really good work to try and make this happen.
Absolutely. I think it's one takeaway to get from this. I think that's absolutely correct. Andrew Rogers, thank you so much for your time. It's been great. Learned so much about your journey from law school to the hospital. And I hope if anyone might be interested in this kind of work, I hope they can reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks Greg Nola for all the great questions. And so next week we have returning guest Gurteg Singh, who was on the pilot episode. I don't know if you saw that, but there was a lost episode. The the recording with Gurteg is was not saved locally, unfortunately, because apparently Twitch doesn't automatically save broadcasts anymore. But we have him, and we also have another guest, Hira Galani, who's a classmate of mine, fantastic, another NCA candidate who and both of them will be talking to us about that process and getting educated abroad and then coming back to Canada to practice. So, should be a great show. Thanks again, Andrew, and take care.
No problem. Thank you.
Cheers.